I still remember the day I stumbled into that dusty little thrift store, the kind where the air feels heavy and everything's covered in a layer of forgotten memories. I'd been teaching art at a local high school in Austin for a few years, so I was always on the lookout for quirky pieces to inspire my students. That's when I saw it, the Harlequin doll. It was tucked between old books and chipped porcelain figurines, but it stood out. The craftsmanship was incredible, the details so precise. The painted smile, the delicate hands. It was both beautiful and eerie. Without thinking twice, I bought it. Just a harmless little doll, right? When I got home, I put the doll on a shelf in my living room. It fit perfectly with my eclectic collection of oddities, and I couldn't help but admire how lifelike it looked. Its eyes were painted so vividly that they seemed almost real. For the first few days, everything was normal. I went about my routine: work, dinner, a little TV before bed. But then, strange things started happening. I'd hear faint creaks at night, like something shifting in the house. At first I thought it was just the old pipes or the wind, but deep down I knew it was something else. I started paying more attention, and the noises seemed to come from the living room, right where I had placed the doll. Sometimes it was soft, almost like a subtle movement. Other times it was more of a creaking sound, as if something or someone was shifting its weight. I tried to ignore it. I even convinced myself that it was my imagination playing tricks on me, that the creaking was just the house settling. But something about the way that doll sat on the shelf, always smiling, started to get under my skin. One night, as I sat on the couch reading a book, I swore I saw the doll's head tilt ever so slightly. I blinked, shook my head, and laughed it off. It was late, and I was probably just tired. But the next night, when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It's a strange thing, isn't it? That creeping sensation on the back of your neck, like someone's eyes are on you. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. That's when I started thinking back to the thrift store. I hadn't asked the owner about the doll, where it came from, or if there was any history behind it. It just seemed like a random piece among the clutter. But now, I wondered if there was something more to it. Maybe it wasn't just an ordinary doll. Maybe, just maybe, there was a reason it had ended up in that forgotten corner of the shop, waiting for someone like me to find it. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the doll's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room, always watching, always smiling. I told myself it was just the angle, the way it was positioned on the shelf, but no matter where I stood, those painted eyes never left me. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a harmless little doll. Something was very, very wrong. I tried to brush it off. I even considered taking the doll down, maybe putting it in a box or giving it away. But something about it kept me from doing that. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something darker, that made me leave it there, watching me night after night. And as the days went on, things only got stranger. It didn't take long before I realized that I wasn't imagining things. The doll's painted eyes were definitely following me, no matter where I stood in the room. It was subtle at first, just a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I'd move around the living room, glance back at the shelf, and swear the doll's head had shifted ever so slightly. But then I'd shake it off. I mean, how could a doll move on its own? It's ridiculous, right? But soon, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every morning I'd find the doll in a different position. I wasn't talking about major changes, just small things. One day its head was turned slightly to the left. The next day, its right hand seemed to be raised. I kept trying to convince myself that I must have bumped it or moved it without realizing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't touched it. The doll was moving, and I had no idea how or why. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Who would? I'd come home from work, make dinner, and try to act like everything was normal. But every night when I'd settle into the couch, I could feel it. Those eyes, watching me. I tried to avoid looking at it directly, but that only made the feeling worse. It was like the doll was alive in some way, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. And whenever I did, those eyes, They just wouldn't stop staring. As the days went by, the unease turned into dread. I started having trouble sleeping, constantly waking up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something shifting in the other room. The doll was always there in the morning, sitting on its shelf, but it never looked the same as it did before I went to bed. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, but every time I walked into the living room, it felt like stepping into a nightmare. I started questioning everything. Was I losing my mind? I even tried moving the doll to different parts of the house, thinking maybe that would stop the strange occurrences. But no matter where I put it, the doll's eyes still seemed to follow me. It didn't matter if it was in the kitchen, the bedroom, or even the closet. I could feel it watching me, waiting. And the worst part, I wasn't sure what it was waiting for. I knew something had to be wrong with that doll. Maybe it was cursed, or maybe there was some twisted spirit attached to it. Whatever the reason, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was more than just a lifeless object. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to demand my attention. It was as if the doll was taunting me, daring me to do something about it. But I had no idea what to do, or if there was anything I could do. At night, the house felt colder, darker, even when all the lights were on. And every time I walked past that shelf, I could feel those eyes boring into me. It was getting harder to pretend like everything was normal, but what could I do? Throw the doll away? Burn it? Somehow, I knew that wouldn't help. Whatever was happening, it had already started, and I had a terrible feeling that it was only going to get worse. It was a Tuesday night, and I'd just gotten home from a long day at work. I was exhausted, mentally drained, and all I wanted was to relax. I dropped my bag by the door, headed straight for the couch, and didn't even bother to turn on the lights. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlight outside. That's when I saw it, something in the corner of the room. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe the way the light was playing tricks on my tired eyes. But as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, my heart stopped. Standing in the corner, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was tall, about human-sized, draped in shadow, but I could make out its pale face, white as porcelain. The shape was unmistakable. It looked just like the Harlequin doll. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way that could be real, right? Dolls don't grow to human size. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and reached for the light switch. The second the room lit up, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I glanced around the room, expecting to see something, anything that would explain what I'd just witnessed. But there was nothing, except for one thing: the doll. It wasn't on the shelf anymore. It was sitting on the floor, right where the figure had been standing. Its eyes were locked onto mine, that same eerie painted smile frozen on its face. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. How had the doll moved? And what the hell was that figure? I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the doll was right there, on the floor, staring up at me like it had been waiting for me to notice. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave it there, but I didn't want to touch it either. Every fiber of my being told me that moving it would only make things worse. Eventually, I forced myself to pick it up. My hands were shaking as I placed it back on the shelf, trying to act like everything was fine. But nothing was fine. I knew what I'd seen. I could still feel the presence of that figure, lingering in the air, even though it was gone. The room felt wrong, like it wasn't just mine anymore. Something else had made its home there, something that wasn't going to leave easily. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the corner of my room, just waiting for me to notice it again. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a stressful day. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse, and I had no idea how to stop it. I didn't want to believe it, but part of me knew that the doll wasn't just a doll anymore. The worst part? I had no one to talk to about it. Who would believe me? That my antique doll had somehow come to life and was haunting my house? I could already hear the laughter, the disbelief, but I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy. Something was happening, and it was only a matter of time before that figure came back. It was the night after I'd seen that figure, and I was already on edge. Sleep had been elusive, and every sound in the house felt amplified, like the walls themselves were breathing. Around 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't quite place. At first I thought it was just the wind outside, maybe a branch tapping against the window. But as I lay there, trying to make sense of it, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. It was soft at first, a faint whisper, almost like someone was speaking in another room. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The voice, it wasn't in any language I could recognize. It was raspy, like someone speaking through dry lips, their words half-formed and distorted. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and it was coming from somewhere just outside my bedroom door. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to face whatever was making that sound. But I couldn't just stay in bed and pretend it wasn't happening. With trembling hands, I reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on. The whispering continued, creeping through the cracks in the door. I forced myself to get up, every step feeling like a mile as I made my way to the hallway. As soon as I opened the door, the whispering stopped. I stood there in the dark hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then I saw it, the doll. It was sitting in the hallway facing my bedroom door. It hadn't been there before. I hadn't touched it since the night I'd seen the figure. My mind raced. How did it get here? And why was it sitting there, as if it had been waiting for me? The house was cold, unnaturally cold, and I could feel a presence in the air, something that wasn't visible, but was undeniably there. I crouched down, hesitating before I reached for the doll. The second my fingers touched its porcelain skin, the whispering stopped, completely. The silence was deafening, like the house itself was holding its breath. But as I picked up the doll, I felt something else, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct told me that whatever was behind me wasn't human. My skin crawled as the breath continued, icy and unnatural. I could feel it, like something was right there, inches away, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I bolted. Without thinking, I ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely catch my breath. The whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more frantic, like someone was whispering directly into my ear. I covered my ears with my hands, trying to block it out, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't coming from the hallway anymore. They were everywhere, filling the room, filling my mind. I didn't know what to do. I curled up in bed, pulling the covers over my head like a scared child, hoping it would all just stop. But it didn't. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, and no matter how tightly I covered my ears, I couldn't escape them. The doll was still out there, somewhere in the house, and I knew, somehow, that it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. I couldn't take it anymore. After that night, I decided the doll had to go. I didn't care if it sounded crazy. I knew what I'd experienced, and I wasn't about to let it get worse. The next morning, I grabbed an old storage box, threw the doll inside, and taped it shut. My hands were shaking the entire time, but I didn't stop until I'd shoved the box into the deepest corner of the storage closet. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Except it wasn't that easy. Even though the doll was out of view, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, waiting for the next move. I moved out of that house within a week, packed up everything and found an apartment on the other side of town, far away from the nightmares that had taken over my life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel normal again. The apartment was quiet, peaceful. No whispers, no creaking sounds in the middle of the night. I actually started sleeping again. I even convinced myself that whatever had been happening in that old house was tied to the place itself, not the doll. Maybe the move was all I needed to leave the horror behind. But of course I was wrong. It started again a few weeks after I'd settled into the new place. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard it. A soft whisper, just like before. My heart stopped. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. Louder this time. Closer. The cold dread I thought I'd left behind came rushing back, and I knew, somehow I knew, that the doll wasn't in the storage box anymore. I didn't even want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I got out of bed and turned on the light. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was the figure I'd seen in the old house. The full-sized harlequin, pale and lifeless, its painted smile wide and empty. I froze, unable to breathe. Its eyes were dark, hollow, but I could feel them boring into me. It didn't move, but I could sense that it didn't need to. Its presence was enough to paralyze me, to make me feel like I was drowning in my own fear. The whispers grew louder, swirling around the room, and I could feel that cold breath again, brushing against my skin. I backed away, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. The harlequin was here, in my apartment, and it wasn't going to leave. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it would find me. It had always been with me, ever since that day in the thrift store. I just hadn't realized it until now. I tried to tell myself there had to be a way out of this, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escape. The harlequin had followed me, and it wasn't going to stop. I could feel its gaze on me even when I wasn't looking. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound made my heart race. The doll was no longer just an object. It was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. Now, every night I wait. I wait for the whispers to start, for the figure to appear again. I know it's only a matter of time before it decides to do more than just watch. And when that happens, I won't be able to run. I won't be able to hide. The harlequin will be there, smiling, waiting for the moment it finally takes what it came for. My name is Laura Simmons, and I never thought I'd be the type of person to sit here and tell you about something like this. I'm 28 now, living a relatively quiet life in Maple Creek, a small town where not much happens. Well, at least that's what I used to think. As a graphic designer, I've always been surrounded by creativity and imagination, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. You see, it all started as a dare. My friends, always the adventurous types, knew I wasn't easily scared, so they dared me to enter the old abandoned carnival funhouse. It was a local legend around here. Everyone had heard about it, but nobody ever took it seriously. Well, I didn't either. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was. The funhouse had been closed for decades, but it still stood on the outskirts of town like a forgotten relic. My friends told me stories about strange things happening there, people going missing, eerie laughter at night. But we were all laughing at how ridiculous it sounded. I wasn't about to back down from a challenge. I thought it would be nothing more than a creepy walk through some dusty old corridors. It seemed like a harmless way to prove a point, maybe get a good laugh out of it. The night was colder than usual for Maple Creek, and the moon hung low, casting an almost ghostly glow on the old carnival grounds. I remember my heart racing with a mix of excitement and nervous energy as I approached the funhouse. My friends stood a few feet behind me, jeering and joking, pushing me to go inside. I waved them off, acting braver than I felt. I don't know why, but the moment my hand touched the rusted door handle, I felt this strange chill run through my body. Not a typical cold, but something deeper, almost like a warning. Still, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges echoing louder than it should have. My friends were outside, their laughter fading as the door closed behind me. That was it. I was alone in this place, and I told myself it was just an old building, nothing more. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and for a moment, I wondered if I should just turn around and tell my friends it was too easy, too boring. But something kept pulling me further inside, something that made me want to see more. The deeper I went, the stranger it felt. The air was thick, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I could almost taste the dust in the back of my throat. Still, I kept going, telling myself it was all just part of the dare. I didn't want to give my friends the satisfaction of thinking they'd scared me off. What I didn't know, as I wandered further into the funhouse, was that this wasn't just a simple prank. Something was waiting for me. Something far worse than I could have imagined. The moment I stepped further inside the funhouse, everything shifted. The air got colder, almost unbearably so, and I could smell this faint, rotten odor that made my stomach twist. It was like the building had been abandoned for so long that it had absorbed the decay. I tried to ignore it though, convincing myself it was all part of the experience. The funhouse was supposed to be unsettling, right? But what hit me the hardest wasn't the smell, it was the silence. This place was dead quiet. No wind, no creaking wood, just this thick, uncomfortable stillness that felt unnatural. My footsteps were the only sound, echoing off the dusty walls. I pushed forward, turning corners through what seemed like endless hallways of warped mirrors and faded paint. It was disorienting, the way the mirrors bent reality, reflecting versions of me that didn't quite look right. I'll be honest, at one point, I caught my own reflection and almost screamed, because for a second, I thought someone was standing behind me. My nerves were starting to get the better of me, but I kept moving, trying to shake it off. That's when I heard it. The laugh. It was soft at first, like it was coming from far away, barely audible. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that maybe it was just the old building settling. But then, it grew louder, closer, and it wasn't just any laugh. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of laugh that sends chills down your spine because you know it doesn't belong to anything good. I froze, listening as the sound seemed to bounce around the walls, growing in intensity with every second. My heart was pounding, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a trick on me. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But deep down, I knew they weren't inside. They wouldn't have come in after me. And that's when I saw him. Sitting in the corner of the next room, just barely visible in the shadows, was an old clown. His face paint was cracked and peeling, like it had been sitting there for decades. His grin was wide, too wide, stretching across his face in a way that felt unnatural, almost painful. His eyes, though. His eyes were empty, hollow, like there was nothing behind them. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as he sat there, motionless, his laugh still echoing through the funhouse. My brain was scrambling to make sense of it. He wasn't real, right? He couldn't be. But the longer I stood there, the more real he felt, like the darkness around him was alive, wrapping itself around me, pulling me in. That laugh. It wouldn't stop. In a panic, I finally broke free from whatever had held me there and turned to run. I didn't care about the dare anymore. I just needed to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, the laugh followed me. It was always just behind me, echoing off the walls, taunting me. I could feel him too, like he was right there, just out of sight, his grin growing wider with every step I took. By the time I stumbled out of that funhouse, I was gasping for air. My chest was tight, and my legs were shaking from running so hard. The moment I stepped back into the open night air, I felt this rush of relief wash over me, like I had just escaped something far worse than I could even comprehend. I was ready to hear my friends laughing, mocking me for looking so freaked out. But when I looked around, they weren't there. At first I thought they were hiding, still trying to scare me. I called out their names, laughing nervously, trying to brush off the fear that was still crawling up my spine. But no one answered. The whole carnival grounds were eerily quiet, just the faint creak of old rides swaying in the wind. I walked toward where they'd been standing, expecting them to jump out and surprise me. But when I got there, the spot was empty. Not a single sign of them. My heartbeat quickened, but I told myself they were probably just messing with me. They had to be. I pulled out my phone, figuring I'd text them and tell them the joke was over, but there was no signal. I don't know why, but that's when the panic started to set in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they went back to the car. Maybe they got bored and left. But in the back of my mind, something darker was creeping in, something telling me that this wasn't a prank. They wouldn't have left without me. That's when I turned around and saw the funhouse. It was different now. The same old, dilapidated structure stood there, but flames, thin, wispy flames, licked up the sides of the building like it was burning from the inside out. But here's the weird part. There was no heat, no crackling wood, no smoke. Just these eerie, silent flames dancing along the walls. My gut twisted as I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I realized my friends were gone. Not just hiding or messing around. Gone, vanished, like they had never been there in the first place. The carnival grounds, the funhouse, everything felt wrong. Like I had stepped into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I kept calling for them, my voice growing more desperate, but the only response was the distant creak of metal and the eerie glow of those impossible flames. I felt completely alone, abandoned. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened, but nothing made sense. How could a building be on fire without burning? How could my friends just disappear without a trace? I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but something kept me rooted to the spot, staring at that funhouse like it was holding some kind of answer. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows just beyond the flames. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at those flames. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time felt warped in that moment, like I was stuck between reality and whatever nightmare I had just stepped out of. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away from that place. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward, back toward the parking lot where we'd left the car. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that grinning clown chasing after me, but all I heard was the distant creaking of the carnival rides. When I got to the car, my heart sank. It was empty, just sitting there in the middle of the lot like it had been abandoned. My friends were nowhere to be found. I checked my phone again, hoping for some sign of them, but there was still no signal. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to go back, to search the funhouse for them, but the thought of stepping inside that place again made my skin crawl. There was no way I was going back in there alone. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the police. The officers were kind at first, patient even. They listened to my story, took notes, and promised they'd look into it. But as the hours passed, their tone shifted. The more I explained, the more I realized how crazy it all sounded. A funhouse that wasn't really on fire. Friends that disappeared without a trace. A clown that seemed to appear out of nowhere. They didn't say it outright, but I could tell. They thought I was making it up. One officer even suggested that maybe my friends had played a prank on me and left without telling me. I wanted to scream. This wasn't a joke. Something had happened. They did a search of the carnival grounds the next morning, but of course there was no sign of anything strange. No funhouse, no flames, no sign of my friends. It was like they had never existed. The whole area looked like a normal abandoned carnival. Dusty, forgotten, empty. I felt like I was losing my mind. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened. But without any proof, I was stuck. And the worst part? The officers stopped taking my calls after that. Days passed, then weeks. I tried to move on, to tell myself that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe my friends had left me. Maybe it was all some sick prank that had gone too far. But every night, without fail, I would hear it. That laugh, soft at first, like it was coming from far away, just outside my bedroom window. And every night it got louder, closer. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think about anything except that sound, echoing through the darkness. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the whole thing had left me paranoid. But the laughter wouldn't stop. It followed me, no matter where I went. I moved out of my apartment, hoping a change of scenery would help, but it didn't. In fact, it only got worse. The new place had this old, creaky floor, And every time I heard those boards groan, I swore I could hear footsteps. I was being followed. I knew it. After I moved, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. The laughter that had once been distant was now right there, in the room with me. Every night, like clockwork, I'd hear it under my bed. That same slow, deliberate laugh, like the clown was lying there, waiting for me to fall asleep. I barely slept at all anymore. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing with the thought that if I closed my eyes, he would be standing right beside me when I opened them again. The sleep deprivation was starting to get to me, and I knew it, but there was no escaping him. It wasn't just the laughter, though. I started seeing him. At first, it was just in reflections. Quick glimpses in the bathroom mirror, or the reflection of a window at night. His painted face, that cracked, grotesque smile, would flash for a second, and then it'd be gone. I'd tell myself it wasn't real, that I was just imagining it. But deep down, I knew. He was there, watching me, waiting. It wasn't long before I started seeing him in places he shouldn't be. Crowds in the corner of my eye, always just out of reach. I tried telling people, but no one believed me. They thought I was cracking up, that the stress of losing my friends was making me paranoid. Maybe it was, but that didn't change the fact that I knew what I was seeing. I wasn't imagining this. The clown was real, and he was getting closer. The worst part was, there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried everything, moving again, leaving town, even staying with family for a while. But he followed. He was always there, laughing, lurking in the shadows. It all came to a head one night when I found something that sent a chill down my spine like nothing else had. I came home from work, exhausted, and there it was, tied to my bedroom door, a single balloon, red with a faint stain of soot along the surface. I knew what it meant. He was coming for me, just like he'd come for my friends. The balloon felt like a death sentence, a sign that my time was running out. I tried to pop it, to destroy it, but no matter how hard I squeezed, the damn thing wouldn't burst. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The laughter was constant, louder than ever. I could hear the creak of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, like he was pacing just outside my door. I didn't dare open it. I sat in the corner of my room, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for him to come in. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow, but he never opened the door. He didn't have to. I knew he could get in whenever he wanted. He was toying with me, drawing it out. I can't explain why he hasn't taken me yet. Maybe he enjoys the fear, the slow, agonizing terror that's taken over my life. Maybe he's waiting for the perfect moment. All I know is it's only a matter of time before he does. And when he does, I'll disappear, just like my friends. No one will know what happened. They'll chalk it up to some unsolved mystery, some tragic accident. But I'll know the truth. The clown will have claimed another victim, and he'll move on to the next. Because this nightmare, it never really ends. Alright, so my name's Daniel Hayes, and I'm 35, living the typical accountant life in Chicago. Nothing too exciting, really. Until the night of my bachelor party. We rented this remote cabin out in the woods. You know, just me and a few of my closest buddies planning to unwind and have some laughs before the big day. We had the usual stuff lined up, drinks, games, maybe some lighthearted pranks. But man, no one expected the creepy twist the night was about to take. Everything started pretty normal, until this clown showed up out of nowhere. Yeah, a clown. None of us hired one, and I figured it was just a gag from one of the guys. But everyone swore up and down they didn't plan it. At first, it seemed harmless. You know how clowns are supposed to be funny? This one wasn't. He just stood there, not saying a word, with this big fake grin plastered on his face. I'm telling you, there was something off about him right from the start, but we decided to roll with it. I mean, what else could we do? The weird part was, he didn't perform. He didn't juggle. He didn't pull out any tricks. Nothing. He just watched. At one point, I caught him staring at me from the corner of the room, his painted smile not moving an inch. It wasn't funny anymore. It felt like he was studying us, like some predator watching its prey. And even when I tried to break the tension, make a joke or something, he just stood there, unmoving. The night went on, and as people started leaving, the clown stayed behind. He kept lingering in the shadows, just out of sight, but I could still feel him watching. By the time the last guest headed out, I noticed him again, standing near the trees outside, just staring back at the cabin. I tried to brush it off as some weird prank, but something about it stuck with me. The way he was silent, the way his grin seemed so forced, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt personal. Later that night, after everyone left, I couldn't shake the image of that clown from my mind. I thought I saw him again when I looked out the window, just for a second. But then he was gone. I didn't sleep well that night, and that unsettling feeling only grew stronger the next morning. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination running wild, but that clown wasn't done with me. There was something about his presence that lingered, even after the party was over. It was like he left a mark, some kind of dark energy in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew that night wasn't the end of it. A few days passed after the bachelor party, and I tried to put the whole clown thing behind me. It was probably just some weird prank, right? But then Ben, one of my closest friends, went missing. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just off-grid for a bit. We all get busy. But then his wife called, saying she hadn't heard from him in over 48 hours. That's when things started to feel wrong. I couldn't shake this gut feeling that something more was going on, something connected to that clown. I remember meeting up with the guys, trying to figure out what was going on. We thought maybe Ben just needed some space or was pulling a prank himself. You know how friends can be. But when we went to his apartment, it was empty. No sign of him, no note, nothing. Just this weird balloon animal sitting on his kitchen counter, a twisted, deformed shape, like a person crumpled up in pain. I don't know why, but seeing that balloon made my stomach drop. It reminded me of that night, of him. A few more days passed and another one of my friends, Chris, disappeared. Same thing, no warning, no trace. His car was left at his place, his phone was on the counter, but he was just gone. And just like at Ben's, there was another balloon. This time, it was shaped even more grotesquely, like some mangled figure. My mind immediately went back to the clown, even though it seemed ridiculous. I mean, how could it be connected, right? But still, it gnawed at me. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit. The last time I saw these guys was at my bachelor party, the night that clown showed up. The uneasiness I'd felt that night started creeping back in. I began calling the rest of the guys, making sure they were okay. Most of them answered, but they sounded off, like they were all waiting for something terrible to happen. And then, another one disappeared. Each time, a balloon was left behind. It was almost like a signature. But these weren't ordinary balloons. They were twisted into strange, unnatural shapes that didn't make sense. They looked like distorted human figures, bent at odd angles, as if frozen in mid-scream. The balloons were bright, colorful, and yet horrifying. It was like they were mocking us. The disappearances weren't random. I knew it was only a matter of time before something worse happened. Each time another friend vanished, I couldn't help but think about the clown. I kept replaying that night in my head, wondering if we missed something, if there was something more to that figure that we didn't see. The clown wasn't just some guy in makeup. He was something else, something darker. And whatever it was coming for us. It wasn't long before I realized it wasn't just the people at the party who were at risk. Whatever was happening, it was spreading. That damn clown had left more than just a weird vibe. He'd left a curse, and I knew I was next. After the third friend went missing, I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just some coincidence. I started noticing things. At first it was small, like glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye. But then it became more direct. I'd be driving home from work, and I'd swear I saw him, standing in the distance, just outside the glow of the streetlights. It was always the same, that wide grin, those empty eyes, and as soon as I blinked, he'd be gone. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just paranoid. But every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I'd see a shadowy figure. It didn't matter where I was, at home, at the office, Walking down the street, he was always there, not close enough to touch, but close enough to remind me he was watching. And the worst part, he never moved, just stood there, grinning like he knew something I didn't. It was maddening. I told my fiancée about it, trying not to sound crazy. She brushed it off as stress. I get it. No one wants to believe their soon-to-be husband is being stalked by a clown. But it wasn't just stress. I could feel him getting closer. Every night I'd see that damn face in the reflections. First in the windows, then in the mirrors, and finally, on the screen of my TV. There he was, staring back at me, as if he'd crawled right out of my nightmares and into my living room. As more of my friends vanished, the sightings became more frequent. The clown wasn't hiding anymore. He wanted me to see him. I could feel the weight of his gaze every second, even when he wasn't there. It's like he was haunting my every move, like I was trapped in some twisted game that only he understood. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I was running out of time. One night I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing. The room was dark, but there, at the foot of my bed, was a figure. For a second, I thought it was a shadow or a trick of the light, but no, it was him. Standing perfectly still, watching me sleep. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the light, but by the time I switched it on, he was gone. No sound, no trace. Just the lingering terror that he could come back anytime he wanted. The next day, I found another balloon on my doorstep. This one wasn't twisted into some grotesque shape like the others. It was just a simple, round balloon with a smiley face drawn on it. But the message was clear. I was next. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. He was coming for me, and he wanted me to know it. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. The pressure was suffocating. Everywhere I turned, I saw his face. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I couldn't even talk to anyone about it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until I was gone too. By the time the last of my friends disappeared, I was the only one left. The isolation was unbearable. I stopped going to work, stopped talking to anyone. I couldn't focus on anything except that clown and the fact that he was getting closer every day. I could feel it in the air. Every night, I expected to wake up to find him standing over me again, waiting. But instead, something else happened. Something worse. It was a Tuesday night. I remember that clearly. I had been pacing the house, trying to stay awake, when I heard a soft pop from the living room. My heart nearly stopped. I crept over, terrified of what I might find. And there it was. A balloon animal sitting in the middle of the room. But this one wasn't like the others. It was shaped like a face, a human face, twisted in agony, mouth open in a silent scream. I could see every detail, from the contorted lips to the hollow eyes. It was unmistakable. It was a warning. That's when I knew. I was next. There was no escaping it. I had tried ignoring him, running from him, but it was no use. The clown was coming for me, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. I thought about leaving town, just packing up and disappearing. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd follow me. He always followed. So I decided to confront him. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I thought that if I faced him, if I looked him in the eyes and demanded answers, this nightmare would finally end. But when I stepped outside that night, the air was thick, oppressive, like it was holding its breath. I knew he was there before I even saw him, standing under the streetlight, perfectly still, with that same painted grin. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched me, waiting. I walked toward him, my hands shaking, but my mind was made up. This was it. I was done running. As I got closer, I realized something horrifying. His smile wasn't painted anymore. It was real. His lips stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. His eyes, once blank, were now locked on mine, full of something I can only describe as hunger. I stopped in my tracks, frozen. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. The clown stepped forward just once, closing the distance between us. In his hand, he held another balloon, this one slowly deflating. As it shrank, the air hissed out, like the last breath of something dying. He reached out, offering it to me, and for the first time I noticed my name written on it in thick red ink. I backed away, heart pounding, but it was too late. He had marked me. I didn't know what that meant, but I could feel it. This was the end. I ran back into the house, locking the door behind me, but I knew it wouldn't stop him. He was coming, and there was nothing left to do but wait. That night I sat in the dark, staring at the twisted balloon face, knowing that when the time came, I wouldn't even hear him. Just like the others, I'd be gone, and no one would ever know what happened. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, everything felt wrong. The air was heavy and the house was eerily quiet, almost like the world had stopped turning for a moment. At first I thought maybe it was over, that I had somehow survived the night. But then I saw it. Sitting on the floor right next to my bed was a balloon, not just any balloon. This one was twisted into a human figure, but it didn't take long to recognize the face. It was me. My heart sank, and I felt this cold dread wash over me. The balloon stared up at me, its contorted face grinning back with my own features, twisted and wrong. I knew what this meant. He'd found me, but I wasn't gone yet. No, he was playing with me, dragging this out like some sick game. I couldn't sit there any longer. I had to do something, anything, to get away. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. The streets were empty, and every corner I turned, I expected to see him. But he wasn't there, not yet. I knew it didn't matter how far I ran. He'd always be a step ahead. Still, I couldn't just wait around for him to finish the job. So, I drove. For hours, out of the city, into the countryside, as far away as I could go. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching, waiting for the right moment. Every time I stopped, I'd see him out of the corner of my eye, standing just beyond the edge of the light, grinning that terrible grin. It was like he was toying with me, letting me think I had a chance, when deep down, I knew I didn't. Eventually, I found myself in some secluded part of the city, far from anyone or anything familiar. It was just me and the darkness. And that's when I saw him again, standing under the streetlight, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to run, but I knew it wouldn't help. This was it. The end. I walked toward him, my legs heavy like I was moving through water. The closer I got, the more his grin stretched, impossibly wide, like his entire face was splitting open. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time I felt like I was looking into something far worse than just a clown. This was something ancient, something that had been hunting people like me for a long, long time. Before I could react, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in an empty room. No windows, no doors, just me, alone with that final balloon animal in my hand. It was twisted into my face, my features frozen in terror. And around me, scattered on the floor, were the balloons of my friends, each one shaped into the faces of those who had disappeared. They were all here, trapped in this endless nightmare with me. But the clown, he wasn't done. I could feel it. He was still out there, hunting, waiting for his next victim. And I knew, as long as he was out there, I wasn't the last. There would always be someone else.